Okay, I think we'll get started. So a very warm good afternoon. Well, it is literally a very warm afternoon. So very good afternoon to all our participants and of course our speaker today, Ms. Anna Moore. Thank you for making time for our event, Anna, because it's literally the last working hour of our week. So we really appreciate your time. My name is Malobi Mukherjee. I think a lot of the participants, a lot of our attendees already know me from the lecturer in the classroom. So I'm going to be wearing a different hat today as a moderator on this really important topic on technology ethics and the green recovery. And I think this is a question that is pretty much on everybody's mind at the moment. And Anna, we are really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and our students and our colleagues who are joining in. We're all asking about how companies are going to prioritize, moving forward in a post-COVID world. So we can't wait. But before we start, I just have a couple of housekeeping rules, which I want to share with everyone. So this webinar is being recorded for publicity purposes. And all our attendees will be able to ask questions at any point of the webinar through the Q&A function, please. And we will have a Q&A session at the end of Anna's presentation. So please feel free to type in your questions as we progress, but we'll take all the questions once Anna is done speaking. Just a little bit about Anna herself and, a very interesting career trajectory as well. So Anna is a sustainability consultant at Eco Business in Singapore. And she works on a diverse range of engagements and issues, including human rights and corporate due diligence, ethical technology, use in supply chains, and sustainability reporting and strategy, as well as stakeholder engagement. Now, she has consulted with various companies on ESG solutions across various industries. She was previously based in London, working for a human rights organization that, holds consultancy status to the United Nations, actually, which is amazing. She has expertise in social risk mitigation strategies that promote global corporate supply chain sustainability. Anna holds a MSc in social psychology from the University of Liverpool. And in addition, she also has postgraduate qualifications in business, human rights law, and corporate social responsibility from the Open University's Law School, as well as having spent time studying forced migration at the University of Oxford. So a really warm welcome to you, Anna. And, we're really looking forward to learning from you. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee, for the warm introduction, and to James Cook University for inviting me here today. Hello to everybody tuning in. I'm really delighted to be joining all of you. I'm just going to share my screen with you now, so bear with me while I do that. Hopefully that's up and you can see my presentation for you guys today. So as you can see, today I have the pleasure of discussing with you technology, ethics, and the green recovery, and the question of how artificial intelligence and data can support sustainable development in global supply chains, and what this means for the green transition. So this question is, of course, in my opinion and many others, it's immensely complex. And it covers three huge areas that companies, new and old, need to consider when adopting technological advancements into their operation models. So the three areas that we want to consider are the philosophical, the ethical, and the practical. So let's begin briefly by exploring the philosophical side of technology, of AI, and of big data. So it seems that when we think of AI, artificial intelligence, people are often very divided in their opinions, and there are arguments for and against this adoption. But the truth is, it is already here. Artificial intelligence is used not only in the technology sectors, but across most industries and sectors. Indeed, we'd be hard pushed to find any industry that hasn't already adopted artificial intelligence and the use of data collection into its operational business models. This means that we're not in a position to think of the what, but that we need to focus our attention on the how. So I'm sure that many of you listening today have algorithms already embedded into your daily life, from the music you listen to, the social media feeds you scroll through, the products advertised to you based on your past purchases or based on your internet browsing history. And so the way that AI works in its most basic form is by collecting data, learning from that data, and then using that data to make choices. So this is the most basic description of artificial intelligence that we can think of. And so this leads me to part of this discussion today, which is the philosophical conundrum of what is intelligence and how can it benefit or disadvantage something like a business or someone like an individual. So philosophers and neuroscientists, researchers of AI in the 21st century are aligned that machine intelligence has indeed an ability to think. So for the sake of argument and to ensure that we stick to today's topic, let's agree that this is the case, that machine intelligence has the ability to think. And I'll look forward to debating that with you later if we come to that. And so, if this is what we're taking as our base argument, then the ethical issues surrounding the ability of machines need very careful consideration. And we can start with that by thinking about the philosophy behind it. So as thinking and intelligent humans, we have laws, we have regulations, we have moral codes that we must abide by if we are to avoid facing negative societal consequences relating to our conduct. And as we understand from the words of Max Tegmark and many others, the human artifact is arguably nothing but the material legal personality recognized by any charter, declaration, or statute or act. Therefore, the argument by many scholars and policymakers alike is that artificial intelligence will require rules to abide by as well. So the question is, should these rules, these regulations, these guidelines, should they be similar or the same to that of a person or what would otherwise be known as a human artifact? And this is where AI technology really differs from other technologies that are not necessarily interconnected with the concepts of philosophy. So concepts such as action, consequence, consciousness, indeed, the concept of needing philosophy to understand machines has, believe it or not, been around for centuries. In fact, some scholars, such as David Runciman, during his tenure at the University of Cambridge, even argued that the thoughts of some political philosophers from centuries past were dealing with these such conundrums. Famous works such as Hobbes's Leviathan is argued to be looking at these sorts of conundrums that we're dealing with today, and that's from the 17th century. In more recent history, we have scholars such as Professor John McCarthy at Stanford, who in the 1980s started drafting the philosophical blueprints for taking artificial intelligence forward into the 21st century. So why is this important? This is important because machine learning is created to mimic the learning neurons in the human brain. Now that's a very, very basic level of description, and there will be computer scientists and AI algorithm designers all over who will say you cannot break it down to that. But for the sake of time today, that's what we're thinking about. So we're thinking about machine learning, continuously learning from new information to make informed choices. And that idea is the idea to mimic what the human brain does with the neurons inside it. And if we are to believe expert predictions, then artificial intelligence is likely to start outperforming humans in some tasks in 5 years, in other tasks 10 years. And there are some well-researched predictions that suggest that over the course of around 100 years, it is predicted that almost all human jobs could be performed by AI and machine learning. So I'm not saying this to scare people or to create any sort of alarm. Indeed, I hope that for many of you, these concepts are both daunting and exciting to think about and consider. What I'm trying to do today is to get us thinking about why we need to consider the role of human judgment and artificial intelligence judgment in a world where artificial intelligence becomes more and more prevalent and does more and more tasks. This, of course, includes the role of AI in business. And Alan Turing, who is one of the fathers of artificial intelligence, once said that if machines can behave as intelligently as a human being, then surely the machine is as intelligent as a human being. I'm slightly paraphrasing there. But this can essentially be viewed as, at least in my opinion, the AI equivalent of I think, therefore I am. And so this brings me on to my next point, which is ethics. The ethics behind all of this technology that is already in our lives. And so when we speak of ethics, we of course do not only refer to the morals of AI and machine learning, but indeed the legality of it and the legal challenges that are still unclear on both an international and a state level as to what we do as this technology advances far quicker than our legal systems. There are two things one must bear in mind when thinking about the ethics of AI or the ethics of continuous technology and machine learning and data collection. And so the dilemma is that on the one hand, it is very difficult to legally recognize, especially artificial intelligence, in terms of the human rights doctrine, or on the other hand, it can be quite hard to reconcile it in terms of something that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with, which is the privacy doctrine of all of this. And so there is, of course, an overlap between these two elements. So on the one side, you have the rights element of artificial intelligence and technology and that use, but also privacy. So there's an overlap there, but they are not one and the same. And so as these technologies become more and more fundamentally embedded into human society, the laws that we have in place now need to evolve, and they need to evolve at the same time as our changing societal understandings, much like we've seen with the laws evolving in terms of something like discrimination, for example. So this is not uncharted territory. Our laws, of course, do evolve very successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully as new ways of thinking, new societal understandings come in. And with that, especially here, is technology. And so AI leaves us in a continuous dilemma, especially an ethical one, because it is at once a very real, intelligent, thinking piece of equipment. At the same time, it's programmed and it's immaterial, and it's in some senses not real. You can't see it or touch it. So of course, when the owners, the very smart developers of these technologies bring them in, and develop them for the use either at scale for consumer use or starting out, there are often very robust ethical principles by which a program, as it's developed, is aligned to. And this is because the developers understand more than anybody the capabilities of the tech to extract data from large, vast data texts. So ethics, these rules that we abide by, are often embedded into the developing stages of this technology. The issue that we face as a society is that these technologies are then sold for use by third parties. And so the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, as these technologies are sold on, does the technology become less powerful because it's further away from the developer? No. Do the ethics initially embedded into the development of the AI remain robust? No, they often don't. And this is one of the biggest problems we're facing across sectors and industries globally today, which is AI is not necessarily being built without robust ethics. However, it is being disseminated and used globally without robust ethics in place as it goes on to the third-party usage. And so that is really of great concern, and we need to start thinking more and more about what that means, especially as these technologies are already being used everywhere, from food to agriculture to media. We can access them in commerce, and yet companies that adopt these technologies are not necessarily informed with the know-how or the understanding or the ability to truly consider and implement robust ethical frameworks with the technology that they're using. And that's from e-commerce, is as you all well know, that's where these algorithms are really used heavily. And so this lack of sort of deep knowledge around the technologies that are being used for these third parties has huge implications for both, as we mentioned earlier, the human rights doctrine and the privacy doctrine. So ideally, this legislation would already be in place before the technology is rolled out. But as we know, this is not always the case. And so many of you will be asking yourselves from an ethical standpoint and from a legal standpoint, well, whose responsibility is it to govern AI systems? Whose responsibility is it to govern technology as it's rolled out? So ideally, it would be the responsibility of the government in each nation. But as we know, and many of us are very aware, updated legislation, especially when it comes to technology, is lagging. I once heard someone describe the legal system in a way that has always stuck with me. And they said, if you put a legal contract in front of someone who came from the 18th century, and you just put the legal contract on a desk in a very plain room with a window, and you brought a legal scholar or practitioner from the 18th century to look at that contract, by and large, that person would fully understand what was and was not legally binding from that contract. Yet, if you bring that same person to the same desk and you show them your smartphone, they would have no idea what was going on. And so the reason that that example is powerful is because it explains quite well, I think, how our legal systems have not yet caught up with the exponential growth of the technological age. So that's AI, that's blockchain, that's big data. And the issue here is that these technologies have already been part of our social fabric for nearly 20 years, maybe a little bit more than 20 years. And this is not to admonish the legal sector in any way. And there are fierce and ongoing academic debates about whether rights and privacy in relation to technology should be extended to industry, whether industry should be making these decisions rather than governments. And the issue here, as argued by many international legal experts, is that corporations, as they stand, do not necessarily have an international legal personality. What that means is that there are different jurisdictions transnationally that corporations work through and with, but that as a whole, they don't necessarily have an international legal personality. So where does that actually leave industry? Because that's the big question here, isn't it? So it means that for industry, we need to look at frameworks that are available. And these frameworks are things such as the guiding principles on business and human rights, developed by the late Special Representative of the Secretary General on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises, a man called Professor John Ruggie. It is strongly advised, and it has been for quite a while now, that industry, whatever industry it is, adapt these frameworks to fit their own corporate personality. So, for example, a huge company that all of you will know very well, Unilever. Although far from perfect and has received some very serious negative press recently around its use of single-use plastics, that to one side, because it is a far from perfect conglomerate, but Unilever was one of the first adopters of this method, of the method of taking the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights and then structuring them to try to unpick and understand where there were failings in its business. And because of these sorts of maneuvers on a corporate level, that means that even today, even with the bad press that Unilever has received in recent weeks, it is still, as a huge international company, it is still widely recognized as a corporation that ranks reasonably highly in terms of sustainable leadership. So I say this as surely, you know, all industry, big and small, established and starting out, that uses and adopts AI should have in place robust human rights-based policies to mitigate the negative consequences of the technologies that are being used, both for the business and for the end user of the product or the business in question. And so you're probably wondering, well, why a human rights-based approach? Why not another kind of approach? And the reason for this can be boiled down quite simply in that ultimately it's the data of communities, groups, individuals, families that is being collected for the gain of the company. And so I personally don't believe that data collection or AI surveillance is a bad thing, far from it. You know, without it, for example, without collecting vast amounts of individual data, the pandemic we are all currently living through would have been far, far worse. So it's not that we shouldn't be using technology in our businesses. We should, but we do need to take into very serious consideration human rights and the AI and the technological advances in this domain, because otherwise we risk on losing out essentially on the many benefits that AI and data collection and these wonderful technologies like blockchain have to offer. And in its place, we have, rather than using it as a potential to increase human capacity and resilience, it could be really detrimental to us going forward. And so the reason that this is important to think about is because corporate abuse, corporate human rights abuse, occurs when there is an overlap between the individual vulnerability of a person's socioeconomic status, societal rejection in part of poverty, and then systems of law failing to protect those with the weakest hand to play. So unfortunately, the people who will suffer the most from unethical AI practices are likely to be the vast populations of people who have a weak hand to play in terms of the global economy. So let's think about that in terms of supply and demand in our supply chains. So when we're thinking about things like labor protection and how we can use technology to support what's going on right at the other end of the supply chain, so not the shiny Amazon boxes and lovely things coming into our homes that we've ordered, but right at the other end of the supply chain where there's somebody in a factory maybe being exploited. So this is a case of supply and demand like no other. Okay, so supply being supported by poverty, identity, discriminations, limited labor protections, and restrictive mobility regimes, and then demand supported by concentrated corporate power and ownership. So that's outsourcing, that's irresponsible sourcing practices, and the governance gaps that we've just talked about. And so what does this mean for business? Why does this matter? It matters because over the last decade, many countries around the world have passed laws on corporate rights abuses. And so in several states, different legislations have come to the fore that really highlight the need for corporations to have a responsible business practice at their core. And in addition to this, more and more governments and regional dialogues are beginning to require that companies identify and prevent both human rights abuses and negative environmental impacts that are coming from their supply chains. So that includes the companies they control directly and the subsidiaries that companies work with. And that could be a subsidiary company in another country. So this is particularly important because the argument from leading experts is that where there is corporate exploitation of human beings at play, environmental destruction may not be very far behind. And so there are debates that even go as far as to suggest that the climate crisis that we've all been hearing so much about may be unresolvable unless modern slavery numbers significantly drop. So that's thinking about supply chains from the deepest parts of Central Africa, where materials for our technological devices are mined, to the pandemic-fueled need for medical supplies from production lines in Malaysia, across to the demanding fast fashion factories of places like Mauritius, and the unsustainable labor practices and ecocide that occurs across many, many industries. So the future of work and human rights due diligence is a crucial means to managing not only risks in our corporate supply chains, but also to managing the climate crisis. And so making robust human rights due diligence part of standard business practices is really essential to advancing corporate respect for things like achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and moving forward with our targets to net zero, which I'll touch on shortly. And so as we move out of the pandemic, which we're all hoping will happen very soon, we need to be thinking about the sort of guidelines that our businesses will be following. And in some, of course, laws and legislations and regulations are only as powerful as the governments and the businesses willing to uphold them. So when I speak to industry leaders as part of my work, they often mention that whether it be for environmental protection or human rights, government legislation and ethical business practices being brought to the forefront, to the mainstream, is what is really changing industry standards. And so that brings me to my third point, which is the practicality in business operations. So as students, you have a golden opportunity to think about the complex issues of artificial intelligence and data in supply chains and blockchain as a new technology to support transparency in supply chains across businesses, which is wonderful because you won't be playing catch up like a lot of people. You know, you'll be able to understand that there's a real use for artificial intelligence and technology to not only secure the profit of the new and exciting business venture that you go into, but to do it purposefully and with responsible business practices in mind that will keep your way of thinking at the forefront of sustainable business strategy. And so this decade has seen a huge rise in the need for businesses to make sustainability integrated as part of their profit model, and to make that a consideration that people and planet are important and that they matter. And so you'll hear the term ESG being thrown around, and I've already touched on this because what I was talking about was environmental, social, and governance. And as we've witnessed from the pandemic response that we've all been unfortunately part of, keeping our supply chains open and moving is really vital to the way that we live today. Now, there's arguments, of course, as to whether that's okay, and I'm not necessarily here to talk about that right now, but our supply chains do need to remain open as we understand our world in its current form. And so what we've also seen is that companies with solid scores for robust environmental, social, and corporate governance, that's your ESG, companies with robust ratings outperform in the markets in the medium to long term and have a lower cost of debt. And that's according to research by McKinsey. So you can go and look that up online and have a look at what that means for business as well. So for companies that are able to ethically harness AI, the Internet of Things, blockchain, and other technologies for use in their supply chains, they're the companies that are able to reduce operation costs by reducing emissions, reducing wasted resources, reducing hazards for employees, and that includes in the subsidiary parts of the supply chains as well. So essentially, companies that can ethically adopt the use of AI and data are companies that can effectively mitigate risks and minimize the unintended consequences of their business actions, because there is a robust ethical oversight of the workings of the company across the supply chain. And so AI, when it's used effectively in supply chains, can not only improve your business optimization as you monitor fuel usage or share freight costs, but ultimately you improve your environmental impact, which I will come to in a moment. But it can also support businesses to monitor and minimize the negative impact of the parent company and its subsidiaries, because the more that you delve into your supply chains and the more that you audit them, you can uncover the potential risk to employees, the potential risk to customers, and the potential risk to your business flows in real time. So we can consider further the environmental impact of business, which is another vital element of your ethical business standards, your responsible business practices. So companies, as I'm sure you are already aware, are assessed on their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So the term scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, they relate to the carbon emissions of the operations of a company, which should be simple enough for a company to calculate. It's your fuel costs, it's your outputs from your day-to-day operations. Where things get really tricky and where ethical AI use can be used to understand a company's Scope 3 emissions is that the Scope 3, that's the carbon emissions from the value chain. So you will hear these terms going forward: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So lots of companies have very, very robust Scope 1 and 2 reporting. Scope 3, that's the carbon emission from the value chain. And you can see that on here. It's a lot harder to think about because it's once the product has left you. So you see, companies going forward will need to consider the carbon emissions from their operations, but also the carbon emissions from the value chain if the supply chain is to be truly sustainable and if the supply chain is to truly contribute to part of the green recovery that we are all so hoping happens. And so as Scope 3 is generated by your customers after they have used whatever product your company may be supplying them with, you need to calculate this. If you're offsetting your carbon, for example, or maybe you are thinking that you might want to make your product more sustainable at the offset at the point of the factory so that your Scope 3 emissions are smaller. And for those of you thinking, well, that's fine. If a company is an online entity without the physical generation of a product, no big deal. Think again. So each client that uses a laptop or a phone to access that service, that gadget requires electricity, that gadget requires minerals, that gadget requires potentially single-use plastics. And so that's generating emissions. And that means that the company asking of the user to use their services online is also responsible for generating those emissions. And so you cannot, as a business, truly offset your carbon emissions or reduce and minimize your carbon emissions unless you understand all three of these elements. And so this is where things like advanced analytics, AI, machine learning, these will come in, and the ethical use of it across businesses, they will be really what differentiate one business from a sustainable company and a responsible company to companies that will quickly start to seem very outdated and will maybe not be as successful as other businesses with these practices in mind thrive in the new normal. And so your Scope 3 emissions, they're not only vital for business, but companies that are tackling this now are the companies that are doing the most to support positive action towards the climate crisis and to us achieving those sustainable development goals and keeping the temperatures below 1.5 degrees of global warming as per the Paris Agreement that we are all probably aware of. So the thing to consider is that a company using these technologies will inevitably be able to monitor and assess its own business practices. The other thing to consider is that it's very likely that what will be coming into play in terms of legislation and guidance is that the ESG, these scope emissions, will start to be monitored by external companies anyway, using the very AI that we're talking about. And that means that businesses won't necessarily need to give permission to have audits taken. The data will be available, and it means that there will very likely be an objective way of assessing whether or not a business is doing what it needs to be doing. We're not quite there yet, which is why greenwashing is an issue. But as the new normal starts to take hold and business transparency in the coming decade just becomes part of corporate practice, these are the sorts of things that companies will have to contend with as well. And so what does all this mean for the green recovery? Well, technology, as you are already aware, is a huge part of the energy transition. And we're currently going through this energy transition globally, but crucially in our own individual countries and our own individual regional contexts. So you'll have probably heard of the COP26 conference that was held in Scotland at the end of October and early November this year. COP26 is the shortened name, for those of you that aren't aware, for the conferences of the parties for the United Nations Climate Change Conference. And this year was particularly important, not because it was held in Scotland, but because the green recovery is now linked to the post-pandemic recovery as well. And let's take a moment to break down what that really means. Let's think about net zero, for example. So the crucial part here is the net point. So when we're talking about net zero carbon emissions, we're not referring to actual zero. Net zero is the amount of carbon being balanced in and out of the Earth's atmosphere. It's where we get to the point, if we get this right, where global warming does not go above 1.5 degrees. Are we on track for this at the moment? Absolutely not. Indeed, the issue with a lot of the policies and frameworks that were outlined in COP26 was that when calculated by experts for the emissions targets at play, the reachable target would have been around 2.4 degrees of global warming, which is far, far higher than the recommended amount that's needed. So again, we've got this balancing act between what governments are saying that they're going to do versus what industry can do even before legislation comes in. So signs of change are certainly coming in terms of responsible business practice. Whether they come quickly enough is another question, which we can delve into at another time. But this is where your technological innovation and your public and crucially private investment makes the green recovery all the more feasible. And it may not only be investment in a green future, but also divestment of things coming away from coal usage or fossil fuel usage. And so this is only possible, however, if and only if at the same time as these new technologies like hydrogen power, for example, are brought in to fuel our shipping industry and our manufacturing sector, and ultimately to fuel global commerce, that we all, industry and individual alike, that we consume less. And so for the SMEs, the sustainability agenda can seem like a huge thing to take on, because of course it's not like a department of people can necessarily be devoted to this sort of thing like you could have with a much larger business. But for small and medium-sized enterprises, the green recovery is about starting the processes now. And so the reason that's important is because as more and more legislation comes in worldwide, that legislation will allow the monitoring and the probing into supply chains of small and large companies. And so SMEs will need to be ahead of the game, because if they're not, the risk of falling behind could possibly involve monetarily penalization or processes whereby supply chains are not allowed to be continued in their current state. So this journey for a lot of SMEs will start with identifying the risks and the weaknesses in the supply chains and mapping and prioritizing within the supply chain to see which issues need your immediate attention. So that takes us back to the urgent versus the important. And so for SMEs, there's a real need to prioritize relationships for due diligence. And you're probably thinking, what maybe does that mean? But that means that SMEs have an advantage because there are business relationships that they can build rapport on to help prioritize and mitigate any sort of issues that might be in the supply chain, because the supply chains are smaller. And so you can access those factory owners, you can access people who are part of your supply chain. You can see how, for example, if you were an SME, how could you then build a relationship to support suppliers to eliminate human rights abuses or environmental degradation in the supply chain that you're using? Or you might want to consider what grievance mechanisms your companies can put in place to support workers to have their say as stakeholders of your company. The technologies that are available are not always as expensive as they sound. And there are apps and abilities to access these technologies, but you must, it has to be done ethically, of course. And so the issue with the larger companies is that the scale of many of the supply chains, those with responsibility for managing human rights abuses and environmental issues, face a very, very daunting task. And so although for most companies, they will be able to start that mapping, for the smaller companies, it's really about thinking about defining, first of all, what the supply chain is. Where are you reaching out to? What in what sense, where are you getting everything from to manage and develop your product? And this seems like it makes intuitive business sense, but there are a lot of companies out there that don't really know what's going on at the bottom of their supply chain. A bit like a rock at the bottom of the garden where you don't really want to turn it over because all of the creepy crawlies underneath might be a bit too much to look at. But that way of thinking about business doesn't support the green recovery and is no longer really being accepted by the wider business community and crucially by the wider consumer community. And so there's a possibility that with the future that is coming, that there will be an audit of sustainability agendas across companies, and that there will be laws across various jurisdictions that will enable that to happen. And so as we're moving into the post-pandemic world of business and industry and consumerism, there's of course a lot to consider to get these things right. But it's really, really important that the supply chain element is not overlooked. Because once you start to understand your supply chain, you start to understand what's really happening within that business. And then and only then can you start to mitigate the risks to human rights and the risk to environmental degradation, understand your scope 1, your scope 2 and 3 emissions, and use technology as a tool to advance your business in an ethical way. So essentially, all of this green recovery is very possible, but it does involve a future-centric mindset. And terms like net zero can be very confusing to consider, but you can calculate your carbon emissions for a business. And so I'm going to leave it there today. And I want to thank you all very much for listening. And I'm hoping that there may be some questions to answer shortly, and I'll do my best to try and answer those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. I mean, I never thought I was going to hear Leviathan and AI all in the same sentence. So that is a fascinating insight, especially from a philosophical approach and how some of this has already been kind of embedded. Erica, can I ask you to stop sharing the screen if you don't mind, so that we can, thank you. So we've got a lot of questions for you, Anna, believe it or not. We've got about 12 questions, and they've been coming in a flurry.
I'll try my best.
I'm going to crack right on in the interest of time. So the first question actually is, and I think you might have spoken about this a little bit at the beginning, but this is a question on, who should be leading the regulation around ethics, and should it be businesses themselves or government? And to that, one of our students has actually kind of responded with a follow-up question that, businesses and government are all on their own agenda in some senses, and therefore should it then be the responsibility of a body like the UN or a more targeted NGO or something else entirely, which is a neutral party to actually, set up these regulations? So that's a really good question. Thank you, Riley, and thank you, Jacob, I think, who put up these questions. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that question. It's brilliant. And I think that one of the things to consider, or what I like to consider when we're thinking about who should be regulating, should it be industry self-regulation, which we hear about a lot in terms of taxes, and we hear about a lot in terms of other things. So therefore, why would industry wait for government legislation to come in if self-regulation is possible in other parts of the business? Equally, our laws do need to be able to adapt to the fast pace of business as well. And I think that is exactly where, as Jacob and Riley, as you mentioned there, that's exactly where bodies like the United Nations come in, because although they're not legally binding, they are guidance, they are guidelines, so that businesses can then take those frameworks and apply them to their own models while we're waiting for governments to make those changes. And the thing is that it's not only governments of nations, there's regional bodies that are bringing in legislation at the moment. For example, the EU is trying to currently pass something called mandatory human rights due diligence, which means that all businesses, any business that has any link to the European Union, which is many, would have to report on the human rights elements going on in its supply chains. A similar thing is happening with the environmental issues in supply chains as well. So we are seeing regional bodies, governments trying to bring this legislation in, but arguably, should industry be waiting for that legislation to come in? If you know it's going to be slow, and you know that your business practices are not ethical and they are causing wider issues, surely the time to self-regulate is now. However, getting industry to agree on what that self-regulation looks like is very, very difficult. You can self-regulate as an individual entity, but let's say you wanted the entire data center sector to self-regulate with our data as emerging economies are starting to thrive and we're more and more connected across the world. How do you get that sector to agree? And that's where government legislation really comes in, because it gives that agreement to people. So it's extremely complicated. I think self-regulation is a wonderful thing, but getting sectors to agree on that self-regulation is very, very difficult. So that's why we do need government legislation to move a little bit quicker than it does.
And do you have any sense of whether a body like the UN is actually trying to, facilitate a more of a global agenda on this to kind of mitigate some of these other issues that you just mentioned? Is there?
There are frameworks in development, and there are frameworks that are already in place, but they're frameworks, they're guidance. So you can find the guidance out there, and it's often said that that should be a starting point for a business. Look for those international guidelines. But as they're guidelines, there's loopholes. And if we still have the profit mindset as our baseline, then it's going to be very difficult not to fall into the trap of finding those loopholes that make your life a bit easier as a business to make a bit more money from essentially exploitative practices that have been practiced for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we're trying to shift that mindset.
Wonderful. I'm going to crack on quickly because we've now got 16 more questions. So another one of our attendees is asking, is China's approach to AI the same as that of the EU?
That's such a good question. So China has a very different approach to AI in terms of the EU. And that's, if you break it down in some senses, you have your different, if you think about the different conventions that regions are guided by. So not only the philosophy of and the history of nations, but also the conventions in the UN, like we were talking about, that countries decide to ratify as they become, global powers. And so if you look at lots of countries in the EU, they are ratified mainly, they have ratified the political and civil rights element of the United Nations conventions. A country like China has ratified the social, cultural, and economic conventions. So that means that already the mindset for how you use something like AI is on a national level, on a cultural level, on a UN guiding principles level, is very, very different. And so, yes, there are real differences with not only how the government of China or Europe view technology and the use of technology among the general population, but also what is privacy, and how far can you remove someone's privacy, but you're also protecting because you have lower crime rates, for example, which is an argument that's often used in China. You know, Beijing is a very, very technologically advanced city, and the crime rates are quite low. And the argument may be that it's because the way that technology is viewed and used and allowed to be used by municipal and state government and all of these sorts of things is different to what you have in places like Europe, in places like the UK or France, where people would feel that that sort of level of surveillance would be an issue for them on a political and civil rights level. So yes, they are very different, and the context behind the differences is crucial to understand before sweeping judgments are made on either side, because countries, nations, global superpowers, they think in different ways, and so there is not one that is right or wrong. They both have good and bad within them, and so it's yeah, start with your UN conventions and work out from there, and then see where you might be able to see, that's different, and that's why that's thought of like that, or look into the histories of countries, where they've evolved from in terms of what does privacy even mean? Does a particular language have a word for privacy or not? You know, and so yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I hope I've answered it.
And I think one of the very important things you've touched on is the socio-cultural context. You know, that is so important. I mean, we talk about tight and loose cultures in marketing, and I can see that there is a huge distinction between how different cultures are going to perceive, you know, privacy issues, and therefore how that's going to inform government policy as well.
Exactly.
I think the bit about crime itself is also very interesting. And then, but you think about, you know, there's domestic crime might be low, but then, you know, hackers operate at international levels. So then there's that distinction as well. So yeah, absolutely fascinating. So which kind of brings me on to the next question very quickly, which is, you know, are there things that we should fear about AI? I mean, we know we've talked about AI going rogue and all of it, but, you know, is there anything that is very key that we should all be mindful of or be afraid of? You know, just a couple of things, perhaps.
I think being mindful in general is a good thing, and you know, especially with technology. You know, how often are you consenting to your cookies being taken without actually knowing what analytics are being looked at when you are no longer on that website, and how lazy or not are you with your passwords? And I speak for myself as well. You know, all of us, we're all very used to seeing the algorithms as a non-transparent entity that we cannot possibly understand. And we've seen very recently in the recent press with a company now known as Meta, previously known as Facebook, whereby actually maybe the algorithms and the way that data is collected is not as ethical as we might like. So this leads us on to the responsibility of the consumer of those technologies. So I wouldn't say be fearful. I don't think we're heading towards a world where Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to have to protect us all. But I do think that we need to be kind of mindful and careful, and maybe aware that our phones are no longer just phones. They are a complete blueprint of our entire life. And so be really aware that apart from your passport, your phone is a form of ID in a very real sense, and everything is on there. So yeah, so do be careful. Do think about your passwords, your protections, and all those sorts of things. And I think that if we can get our business practices right, then we don't necessarily have huge amounts to fear. However, one genuine concern that does keep coming up is what the labor market will look like and what will replace work once AI maybe can do everything that humans can do. We've been conditioned over the last several centuries to understand that work is validation of who we are. So I suppose if there was one thing to really think about and really try and get your head around, it's what are we if we don't have a work identity? And what does that then mean for society going forward? And how would people fund themselves? Is a universal basic income something that would need to be brought in were AI to become successful at making the decisions that we make every day in our working lives? So it's not necessarily about fearing something, but certainly really considering it. And if it's something that you're interested in, then consider it deeply and let us know what you come up with, especially as you're at that wonderful point of being at university.
Yeah. And so there's a really interesting question there coming up from one of my colleagues who is a computer scientist himself, who's asking, can we actually use AI itself to propose new approaches to ethics, law, regulations, like, things like bootstrapping the process essentially and speeding it up? What's your view on that? I thought that was quite an interesting question.
It's a wonderful question. I think the answer is, of course, that yes, we could. But how would we make sure that the biases that don't already come into our legal frameworks continue? And then who is designing those algorithms for our legal sector? And would they work across contexts? And how would you use them in one country or another to make sure they made sense? Otherwise, you might be looking at some sort of global legal system, but then whose mindset would be in charge of those biases that would be part of those algorithms? So I think it's definitely possible, but again, there are huge considerations when we start to do those things, because we need to work out where our biases are and how can we get rid of them as we develop that sort of technology going forward.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, right? So whose parameters should we use? I mean, companies would have their own agenda, I suppose, and would be quite technical. Steve, I hope that answers your question. I'm just moving a little bit to the human rights part of things. And I've got a question here, which is, what should businesses do to justify the use of AI technologies at the expense or loss of human jobs? Because it always seems to be those at the lower end of the socioeconomic pyramid who are most affected by technological change. And if I may also add in, we do talk about being, reskilling a lot of these people and re-employing them, but we have to also be mindful that some of them don't have basic education, or, some of them could be, illiterate. So how do you reskill them into something so high tech when basic literacy is lacking for some of these people?
It's such a good point. And then it brings us to where ESG meets CSR, which is corporate social responsibility. And so it's thinking about if you are, as a company, deciding, let's say that the community that has been working in your factories for X amount of time is now going to be all put out of business because you've invested in technology that means all of that packing in that warehouse, for example, can be done by robots, then where is your responsibility, your corporate responsibility? What should you do? What should happen? And this is very individual for an organization, especially as you mentioned, Manobi, that it's not necessarily going to be in a place where there's state welfare to fall back on or another job opportunity to fall back on. People may not even be able to have those literacy levels to move on to a different technical skill. However, this is also where our circular economy comes into play. At the same time as we're thinking about this green recovery, there is an idea that as we have a global circular economy, that the upskilling side for workers who, as you say, maybe they don't have a formal education, but for people that can be trained to view waste as an asset, so that the circular economy can have a human touch to it as well. And so that would mean, essentially, if we're thinking about replacing all of those people that currently take our trash to landfill, rather than having them all out of business, they become asset managers of recyclable plastics, of precious minerals, of e-waste. So there is a shift that could happen. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in the world is going to have a wonderful opportunity to have a wonderful job because everybody's upskilled and we're all technologically advanced. It does not mean that. It just means shifting the mindset of what we see as being needed for our economies to succeed. And so there's two things. There's what is the asset management of the waste resources that come out of our companies, and then where is the corporate social responsibility element of companies that are putting people out of work because they choose to then use these technologies.
That kind of brings me on to the next question, which is, I suppose it's from our students. You know, what would be your advice to our students who are looking for prospective careers in, in developing, say, IT skills or, ITM ethics, what would you advise them? Is the course in IT now, almost incomplete without understanding of ethics? And if so, are there enough courses out there for students to think of taking on?
Well, I suppose first of all, you have to think about where your skill sets lie, as in where does your brain naturally sit? If your mind naturally sits in quantitative data, then sure, learn to code, take all the joy you can in the sort of algorithm side of things. If your mind naturally veers towards the humanities and those sorts of things, then perhaps thinking more about the ethical side of business is where you would want to take that. So I think it's hugely difficult to say generally what should people be learning, but the side of ESG, the green recovery, the sustainability agenda is not going away. So if you're thinking of taking a course or starting to learn something and it doesn't have those elements inside, it's probably obsolete and you want to do a different course that is more future centric. That would be my advice.
Are there enough business ethics and AI courses around? I mean, in Singapore, in the region, in Europe, do you know of any?
I think that there's quite a few. Do check that they are well and legitimate always. And the wonderful thing is now that with online learning, you can take advantage of some of the most established institutions without leaving your home necessarily. So also think about, you might lose the camaraderie of being on campus, but maybe you can work at the same time as learning. And that's what lots of people are doing as well. So do have a think that there are lots and lots of fantastic courses out there. And also check out free courses as well. If you're worried about getting in debt or spending too much of someone else's money to get your education started, whether it's the banks or whether it's family or things like this, look at what is there for free. Look at also who on LinkedIn is saying that they'd be happy to mentor a young person for free. These are all things that you can consider and they all count towards your education. It doesn't have to be on campus necessarily. Of course, that's a wonderful option, always.
Yes.
But it doesn't have to be the only option. So yeah, so think about that as well when you're deciding.
I'm just going to move on. I'm kind of moving from sector to sector, from issue to issue, because there are some overlapping questions. So, we kind of move a little bit into the banking area now. And so one of the questions here is, from what I understand, blockchain technologies are touted as the future of financial transactions, yet many banking institutions seem so reluctant to openly support their external development of these kind of blockchain technologies. So, what are your thoughts on the cryptocurrencies like Ethereum? And also as a follow-up, all of these very high-tech, transparent technologies are hugely polluting as far as carbon footprint is concerned. So, how does all of this come together in a meaningful way for us, ethics, environment, AI? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first of all, our financial institutions are understandably reluctant because they cannot be nimble beasts necessarily. They've been around for centuries, some of them. And so with any new technology, we have to consider what the consequences are, of course. And as was mentioned, I think in that question, is that there's not necessarily cryptocurrencies and online currencies are not necessarily better for the environment. So going forward, it's not a case of just adopting them because they're new and because that's what we should do. It's also thinking about what could be the damage in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, if this is our new way of making payments for things. And where does that then take us? So that's why, yeah, blockchain can also be used. It can also be used for so many things, and it is a wonderful way to enable transparency for businesses. But again, you have to understand what it is, and you have to understand what you're using. And so that's why a lot of institutions are not jumping straight away to this. In terms of the point about data, this is so important. And this is where you really do have the overlap of how can AI be used to cool and minimize the carbon emissions from our data centers. That's the power, that's the water, that's the minerals even that are used to build these huge hyper data center structures, which they don't require manpower. So they're not, it's not like they're good for the economy per se in terms of giving lots of people jobs. They're just these giant structures, huge servers. So we can then use AI to reinforce how we make the data centers sustainable, because the issue with the more data centers that we need, the more connectivity that we need, especially I'm thinking about Indonesia, for example, which is about to leapfrog to be, the world's sixth most powerful economy in terms of GDP, which is amazing. And one of the reasons that that's likely is because of not only the emerging economy, but also the connectivity value of Indonesia as a data center hub for Asia, as Asia needs more and more and more connectivity. So with these new hyper data centers being built, so that we can have more connectivity, so we can have financial inclusion, how do we keep them cool? Without putting them under the ocean? Because if you do that, of course, there's marine biology to consider. So there's all of these overlapping issues with our data and our financial institutions that need serious consideration. And AI is as much a solution for those things as anything could be. So I think that I hope that answers your question as well as possible.
I mean, I think there isn't any easy answer for any of these, right? There are just so many complexities involved, and I think, yeah, what you said makes absolute sense. But for every solution, there is some additional problem. So you're always going round and round.
Exactly. There's always unintended consequences, and that's what we need to try and mitigate.
Yes.
That's why risk assessments and risk mitigation and ethical considerations are crucial, Because
Right.
otherwise you put one thing in place and then you realize a few years down the line, oh my goodness, actually, that was a really bad idea. And now I can't go back. And that's what businesses need to remember, is what seems like a really quick, amazing, fantastic solution is not necessarily. And that's, again, comes back to the cryptocurrency point, which is it's not easy just to adopt something straight away. You have to think about these, especially our financial institutions. They have a huge responsibility to do things ethically going forward.
Moving on to the SME thing, right? The SME question. And, so one of our attendees is asking, so in the light of sustainability and leaving the world a better place, as you said, SMEs need to be ahead of time. So in your view, what are some of the concrete solutions or directions SMEs should take? And again, if I may add on, can they even afford to make this transition? Because they're an SME for a reason. They're a lean kind of business. Who finances and invests in that progress in that direction?
Yeah, I think it's hugely difficult for SMEs, but I suppose if you're small, you can start small as well. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, the building relationships with your suppliers, if you're an SME, is probably one of the least expensive and best assets that you have. And so you can have conversations on WhatsApp, for example. You'd have to consider the data and the carbon emissions, but you can have conversations on WhatsApp with your suppliers. What's going on? How are we disposing? How in your factory are you disposing of this? When travel resumes, go and meet them. Have a look, be involved in where you're getting your supplies from. And yes, it is expensive to think about that as a whole, but just start small and start with the relationships and start with the sustainability reporting of your company. So just get those things rolling, because if you're looking at something like a GRI, your Global Reporting Initiative, that a lot of big companies use, you can access it online. They're the sorts of questions you need to be asking yourself, and the sections on carbon, the section on human rights, the section on environmental issues, the sections on, are you training your workers? It's all there for you to see. And so just start going through those sorts of reports, look at those mechanisms. And if you're running your own SME, see if you can get trained on a course that explains to you the role of finance in a sustainable world, so that you're clued up, invest in your own knowledge as well, and build those relationships, because they're going to be key to you shifting what's going on in your supply chains.
Very interesting. Absolutely. And I suppose my next question is kind of looking at this from a more geopolitical perspective. So it's amazing the wide spectrum of questions covering pretty much everything. So one of our attendees asking, what countries are currently dominating the AI space, and is Singapore doing enough to support local innovation?
Fantastic question. So there's a wonderful author called Kai-Fu Lee who writes all about this. And his argument, which I'm going to borrow for this to answer this question, is that who's dominating the AI space? US and China. Why is that? It's because they allow for innovation, they allow for venture capitalism, and they allow for AI and data to be used within their societies quite aggressively. And what that means is that these two countries in particular it's almost like a virtuous circle in their own ecosystems, but it's a virtuous circle, because the more that you allow venture capitalism to use AI and collect data on your populations through commerce, through industry, the more your data learns, and the more powerful your data is, and the more data you have. And so China and the US are by far, they are bypassing everybody. I think what's probably going to happen is that China will bypass the US with this, much like it will with the economy. But that's yet to be seen. But at the moment, they're pretty on par with data and the understanding that data collection is the new currency, right? It's so important. The more data you have, the more you can do. And so definitely US and China. Singapore is extremely well versed in its use of technology in terms of trying to be a smart city, in terms of allowing venture capitalism. So it's punching well above its weight. But the real heavyweight champions are, of course, not of course, but they happen to be US and China because of the way that they support AI use in their own economies.
Interesting. And, you know, and this is another question, very kind of contemporary. So do you think COP26 was a success? If yes, why? If not, why not?
Gosh, I think it's great that sustainability is brought to the mainstream, and there are, of course, there are elements of it that have been successful, but as I mentioned earlier, when experts have broken down what the policies really mean, we're still not going to get below 1.5 degrees global warming, and that's a real issue, especially for many places, but for Singapore, for the Philippines, for so many places. If temperatures rise too much, then our coastlines in the UK, in France, anywhere will obviously be severely impacted. So it's a success because it brought lots of people together and brought people's attention to an important issue. But I think the work probably starts now in terms of what we do with the policies that we put in place and how we implement them.
Yes, interesting. Yeah. We've got about 10 minutes to go, and I've got just a few more. I think we've answered most of them. So if you don't mind, so the other question is, here is a question. You know, so why would companies follow the guidelines given by the UN framework since it's not mandatory, right? So, you know, how does one take more of an educational approach to alert companies to the importance of this kind of framework as a starting point? You know, how does that education start?
It's a really good question. But first of all, one of the really important things to note is that although the UN guiding principles are guidelines, there are national and regional laws that are being put in place. And so it's not really a case of if, it's really a case of when these legislations start to come in for companies. So you may as well start where you as you mean to go on. In terms of engaging with companies, I think it's always worth remembering that sometimes big companies and the people that run them can have quite fragile egos. And so you need to have a balance where you're suggesting what needs to be done, if indeed it is sort of industry advice or advisory or consultancy services that you want to go into, that there's a balance between educating and explaining what needs to be done, but also allowing the company to express what it thinks it's already doing. And there is a balance there. But I think calling out greenwashing is never a bad thing. So yeah, feel free to do that, guys.
I think it ultimately boils down to the leaders, right? It's a leadership thing. It has to be, it can only be a top-down culture, and it can eventually become DNA of the company, but that's a long haul, and one change of leadership can pretty much bring you back to the starting point again.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually, Malobi, that makes me think about the importance of having a diverse board and a diverse leadership structure within a company. So if you notice a company that doesn't have a diverse board, then they're probably the ones that you want to alert yourself to the most.
Yeah. So is a chief sustainability officer something that's going to become a norm, or does it already exist? Are there companies that have those kind of roles?
Lots of companies have those roles. The issue is they're not necessarily filled with people who understand the sustainability agenda. It's just a fancy title That's not for all companies, but for some, that is the case.
Right.
So it's you know, how much sometimes do the chief sustainability officers know is one thing. The other thing is how much power do they have. If it's just a department that sometimes has a say in a meeting, that's not going to change anything. So they need to be able to have access to that leadership team. They need to be able to have access to different departments. So the finance team, the HR team, the operations team. So that chief sustainability officer and the sustainability team need to be able to work across departments to have any sort of impact.
Yeah, interesting. And you know, kind of coming towards the end, what do you think AI will be able to resolve customer privacy concerns as well? Do you think AI itself would have some kind of an inbuilt,
that would be wonderful if the privacy concerns that are brought about by the third-party use of AI could be solved by AI itself. That would be a wonderful thing. It's completely possible, but again, we'd have to think about the unintended consequences there.
Yeah.
If AI itself is trying to deal with the privacy agenda, but also the AI is the reason that we have a privacy issue, then that's very complicated.
But what if if a system is intelligent enough, could it then be held personally responsible for its actions? And this is actually a question as well.
This is such a great question. So this is what I mentioned right at the start, is that if a machine is able to think, it is a thinker, right? So ergo, I think, therefore I am, right? I mean, this is the incredible thing when you're thinking about AI, is that at what point does that system become something that is a thinking entity, and therefore what laws and regulations should it abide by? Should it be the same as you and I, or should it be very different? And if so, why is it different? And why is it the same? And these are really fascinating things to think about. But the strong consensus is that AI and machine learning is a thinking being in its form.
Interesting. And yeah, wow, I never thought of it like that. I didn't realize, because I thought the thinking is being done by the scientists sitting and writing the algorithms, but it kind of takes a life of its own in some ways, because it starts to connect algorithms to make decisions or something of the sort.
Exactly. So that's the basis of machine learning, is that it learns from the data it collects. And so it becomes more able to think through complex problems the more that it just runs.
Right. Very, very interesting. Right. We're literally down to the last minute or so. So very quickly, the COVID tracker app, is it here to stay? And is that going to, I mean, we have no privacy anymore. Everybody knows where we are going, where we're not going. Do you think this is going to be the new norm for the foreseeable future?
It's completely possible. And the thing is that people often say, oh, I hate the fact that the government is tracking my data or whatnot, whichever government it may be, the UK, France, wherever you are in the world. But my response is always, but do you not think Google knows exactly where you are also? Your Google Maps. I cannot tell you how often I might be in town and like, cafe near me, and then Google will give me a selection and I'll pick one and off I go and I have a coffee.
Yes.
So it's not, I think that the considerations are not,
different.
Whether or not we're being tracked, we are being tracked, and we choose to be tracked. And this is a whole other talk about freedom and free will and choice, which I would love to get into another time. But
absolutely, we will do.
These things are here to stay. But before track and trace was in play, or trace together, or whatever
Grab was already
using,
there.
You were already using Google Maps probably, and so
Grab.
you were already using your very own version of track and trace.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think it's because we do it of our own free will, we don't see it as an imposition, whereas now that we have to do it, as a matter of principle, we think that it's an imposition on our freedom and privacy. So yeah, that is a very interesting dimension to that as well. And literally the last question here is, so what can we as humans do to literally make the world a better place? I mean, should we stop flying less, stop owning cars, stop buying things, and just wear everything secondhand? No framed map of the world, which says made in China. Where what can we do which is reasonable, within reason?
It's a really great question. So air travel and car travel amount for, I think, definitely more of our carbon emissions than anything else that we do as humans. There's a piece of research that I led on with my current company for OCBC Bank, where we looked at this in terms of the carbon emissions and the understanding of these things for Singaporeans. So do have a look at that if you want to, and you'll see that our travel is the biggest carbon emitter. But then, of course, consumer goods and food, and these are all things that we need or we believe we need. So on a very basic level, buy locally. If you're in Singapore and you see a lettuce that's from Singapore, buy that, although it baffles me that it's covered in plastic, but that's a conversation for another time. But yeah, if you can, shop locally. If you can also, it's just about reducing the amount we consume generally. All of us in the developed world consume far too much. And that's where the problem arises. So consuming less in whatever way that is absolutely a step in the right direction. If you're thinking about day to day, what can you do? Consume less.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's something we try to practice in our homes every day, and it's a daily learning curve and a battle. But
yes,
thank you so much, Anna. That was absolutely fabulous. I mean, I don't know if you can see the comments coming through on the chat box. We've had senior professors joining us from the UK as well. So I don't know if Professor Peter Case, if he's still here. But he's thanked you for a very thought-provoking presentation and Q&A. And of course, my colleague, who's also the director of SIDBA, Jacob, thank you so much for answering all the questions. This has really taken me by surprise. This is really wonderful. I did not expect to have that many questions, to be honest. And people have really been thinking this, and I'm not surprised, because this is such an important topic, and it's something that's there at the top of our minds all the time. So thank you so very much for your time. And we, can't thank you enough, really. And again, like I said, from philosophy to technology to society to geopolitics, I think we've covered it all. So absolutely fabulous and fantastic.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Manobi.
Absolutely. And keep in touch, take care, and we will let you know how we get on with the editing of this and share the link with you once we're done.